During our plebe year, we all took foreign language classes every other day on the second period in the afternoon. Well, I took advanced French, so I went first period in the afternoon and spent the second period in my room studying. On one such day, an announcement came over the loudspeaker that said, "Attention all cadets, attention all cadets. All cadets who are not engaged in official business will report to the weapons room wearing dress gray to serve as extras in the filming of the West Point TV series. Well, I paid no attention to it since that was for upperclassmen. But a few minutes later, the CQ came by, poked his head in the door and said, "Why aren't you in the weapons room?" And I said, "Sir, I'm a fourth classman and I'm not authorized to be there." He said, "Come with me." He took me down the hall to a cow's room and gave me a dress coat with corporal stripes on it. Well, since we were all the same size in that company, it was easy to put it on and it fit well. And he said, "Go to the weapons room." So I asked him, "Sir, should I walk over there at the fourth class position of attention, i.e. bracing, or not?" And he said, "Well, let your chin hang out, but don't enjoy it too much." So I did, and since there was nobody there, everybody was in class, I made it to the weapons room safely. Once there were a lot of upperclassmen there, and a lot of very pretty girls, some maybe from Lady Cliff or other nearby schools, maybe some from New York. I tried to make some time with one of them, but an upperclassman quickly cut me off, and since I was only a plebe, I was in no position to argue with him. Well, I spent an hour or two over there while they did filming, and mostly on the dance floor or sitting in the booths talking to other people. And when the shooting was all over, I headed back to Central Area. Halfway across Central Area, who should spot me but my old Beast Barracks squad leader. He descended on me so fast and so hard I never knew what hit. He chewed me up one side and down the other and wanted to know why I was in a cow corporal's dress coat and why I wasn't bracing, etc., etc. And before I had a chance to explain anything, fortunately a firstie from my company saw what was happening and came over and bailed me out. He says, "I'll take it from here." He got right in my face and whispered to me, "What the hell are you doing?" I explained to him briefly that I had been directed to go over there by the CQ and I was stranded trying to get back. He said, "Okay, you stick with me and I'll get you back to the barracks. But don't fall out too much." So we made it back safely. And then when the TV series came out and that episode was on, to make matters even worse and add insult to injury, the part that I was in ended up on the cutting room floor.
This is West Point, the United States Military Academy. These are the stories of the men of West Point, the traditions that surround them, the pressures that envelop them. The incidents and events that make up these stories are based on fact. Only the names and dates are changed.
Cadet Lieutenant Charles C. Thompson, Company M2, assigned as your host. I'm happy to have you at West Point.
There were a total of 39 episodes in the West Point TV show, and it included nearly 20 young actors who would go on to become some of the biggest stars of movies and television. The first future star to appear on West Point series was Martin Milner. You saw him later driving a white Corvette across the country on Route 66. Next was Robert Vaughn, who later became Napoleon Solo, the man from U.N.C.L.E. Then there was Chuck Connors, better known as the Rifleman. Leonard Nimoy, who became Mr. Spock on Star Trek, was next, followed by Barbara Eden. She played the part of a beautiful drag, but she was better known later on for wiggling her nose in I Dream of Jeannie. Henry Silva, Pat Crowley, and Brett Halsey were all seen on a number of TV shows over the next several years. Then there was Larry Hagman, who gained fame as J.R. Ewing on Dallas, and Dick Sargent, who played on Bewitched. The famous poet and singer Rod McEwen also had an early start here. Richard Jekyll became a familiar face in many movies and TV shows, and Edward Platt went on to become the chief on TV's Get Smart. Two of the most famous future stars to appear on the West Point TV series were Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen. The cast of future frequently seen stars was rounded out by Larry Pennell, Clu Gulager, and Gloria Talbot. Great actors all, and they all helped to make West Point look very good.
While we were in Beast Barracks, I was walking across Central area and was stopped by a first-classman who engaged in the customary yelling and then said, "Who are you, man?" I thought this was a strange form of address, but I decided to stay in the moment, and I answered, "Me, man, new cadet Gould." I think I witnessed an act of apoplexy. He screamed, hollered, turned red, foamed a little bit at the mouth, and altogether acted like I had disrespected the plebe system and him as an individual. Imagine that. I wonder what gave him that impression.
Baker here. That's Charlie, not Tony. How about a war story? It was well after midnight when the security teams moved out. It was the largest operation we had conducted thus far. The assault squad paced nervously in the sinks of the 12th Division, home of Company F1. Minutes went by. We were now behind schedule when finally Joel Signinus and the ladder squad emerged from the sinks of the 1st Division, headed for the clock tower. Problem was, they only had 2 ladders instead of 4. Nevertheless, the assault squad got out there just as the ladders were being hoisted onto the clock faces. The lights were out in the guard room, so Ted Harkey and his orange squad scurried up the ladders, and in short order we had 2 orange pumpkins. It was Halloween night, 1958. Next came the black squad, painters with real talent, Dave Hogarth 3.0, Baker, his protege, at 2.9. It was all about round eyes, triangle noses, gaping mouths with buck teeth. When finished, down they came, and it was time to make the big decision. Do we settle for 2, or do we go for 4? Well, the lights were still out in the guard room, so we went for it. Ladders were shifted. The orange team finished the pumpkins. The black team was painting away. Things were going like clockwork, pun intended, when suddenly the lights came on in the guard room. Everyone froze. The sergeant of the guard moved forward into the bay window that looked out on Central area. The painters at the top of the ladders were in plain view. They were probably thinking about the hours they're going to be walking on the area in the near future. Tense minutes went by, and suddenly the sergeant of the guard moved back out of the window. The lights went off, and the 2 faces were finished in record time. Company F1, class of 1960, disappeared without a trace. It was a thing of beauty the next morning at breakfast formation. The tactical department had suffered a sound defeat. They had no choice but to commit the janitorial squad.
I think everybody in the class of 60 remembers breakfast plebe year. They were not fun. And somewhere in the folklore of West Point, there was the so-called prune fallout challenge, whereby if one plebe were to eat 100 prunes at breakfast, then the other plebes on his table would get 1 day of eating meals just like an upperclassman at fallout for every prune that plebe ate over 100. Well, one day Buzzy Glenn decided to give it a go. And of course, there weren't 100 prunes in the bowl on one table, so they had to be collected from around the nearby tables. And Buzzy got started with the upper class at the table counting, and we got to 40 and to 50, and Buzzy started to fade, but we didn't let him quit. He kept going and he kept swallowing, and we got to 100, and everybody cheered. And then he ate 7 more prunes, and 3 happy plebes got to fall out for 21 meals. A wonderful luxury in those days. How did Buzzy do? Well, as he recalled many years later, he went back to the sinks, drank a little warm soapy water, got rid of the prunes, washed his face, and went to class. No big deal. But then that was Buzzy.
I guess the most memorable person that I met, though, was President Eisenhower. I met him when Lee Allen and I took our howitzer down and presented it to him in the Oval Office, and once during our June week when he came up to celebrate his 45th graduation reunion. That was when I gave him a class ring and made him an honorary member of the class of 1960. It turned out that it was almost a great disaster for me personally. Here's how the story unfolded. The date was the day when the alumni review was held, followed by the alumni luncheon in the mess hall. And the deal was that President Eisenhower was going to come to my quarters there in the 8th and a half Division immediately after the lunch, and I would make the presentation to him. I found out, however, that I did not have a place in the mess hall, and so I asked when was the earliest that luncheon could possibly be over. The gentleman in charge said absolutely no earlier than 1:30 p.m. I'm not sure of that time, but that's a decent approximation. So I determined that I would be back after going to lunch with my parents at half hour before that and be all set for the president's visit. Well, what happened was, as we approached after lunch, I noticed from the rear seat of the car that groups of alumni were walking away from the mess hall in the vicinity of the clock tower. Imagine my horror, the lunch had ended early. So I jumped from the car, raced across Central area, pushed my way through the bedroom portion of the suite where I lived and to the living area where all the entourage was standing nervously talking with the president. As I burst through the door, I said, I've never been late for the president, for a meeting with the president. And I can never forget those words. General Rich, the commandant, immediately responded, and you better not do it again, which broke the ice all around. And so we had a nice little tete-a-tete there for a moment. I gave my remarks to the president and presented the ring to him. This was the event pictured in this picture. There was some more small talk. The president thanked me for making him an honorary member of the class, and then the entourage left, and the last guy out the door was the commandant. And General Rich looked at me ruefully and said, Mr. Ottstadt, I have never bugled so long in my whole life. That evening, I received a wonderful telegram from the president, and he wished us well, thanked us again for the honor of being made a member of the class of 60, and he signed the telegram, Eisenhower, class 15, honorary 60.
Mole Patrol was a name given to a clandestine after-taps activity involving exploration of the vast network of steam tunnels that wound around beneath West Point Post, connecting buildings for heating purposes. Looking at our 50th yearbook, it seems like there were 3 hotbeds of mole activity: A2, D1, and my home team, K1. Not only was the scenery fascinating, but there was always a risk of being caught in unauthorized places at unauthorized times. But of course, that aspect was what made the patrols exciting. A2 with Bill Blitch as the leader had a lot of mole action. I always wondered about that smirk on Bill's face. Now I know what it was all about. Ray Andrews and Ken Ludovici were all part of the tunnel squad. I thought it was a little strange that a straw man would invest his time in the tunnels, but maybe that's some kind of goat prejudice. One of the patrols went over to the admin building. Now that is a long distance to travel from A2. Wandering around the steam tunnels would get boring if there wasn't a target. The soup's office sounded like a great target to me. On this foray, they took the elevator to the top floor and then locked it in place. They encountered the file cabinets and began looking at cadet records from the 19th century. Then they heard a car door slam and found the MPs making a check on a building. The MPs came up the stairs while our travelers went down one floor and out onto the roof. They heard the MPs go up and then back down after their check. Then they scurried back down into the tunnels and back to A2. That was enough excitement for one night. Another mission was to explore Thayer Hall as it turned into an academic building. After about 15 minutes in the tunnels and a few pivotal decisions at tunnel forks, they reached the objective. After wandering the corridors and exploring the huge auditorium, they turned a corner and came face to face with a security guard armed with a .45. Fortunately, the guard had been dozing, not anticipating a visit from a crew of intruders. They had startled him, toppling his chair as he took off pell-mell to the north. Our invader team scrambled south to get home. They were thinking that an alarm would be set off, bringing TACs and cadet guards searching for empty beds. The hasty escape back through the tunnel maze was accomplished in record time, but with a few unhappy brushes against hot steam pipes, and the night ended without further incident. The search never happened, so they were home safe. Now left wondering how the security guard has been telling his side of the story. A2 moles ran many other patrols, so if you get a chance, ask any A2 file if they had similar experiences. Don't be surprised if the response is a smirk.
Hi, class of 1960. It's Bob Anderson, number 21. Might not be able to make our reunion for the 60 years, but I want to congratulate all that are there. They asked me to put a story together for you. The thing I remember is the first time went out to, Colonel Blake used to take us out to Battle Monument before a home ball game, and give us our first series of plays so we didn't make a mistake. And we were at Battle Monument, just gorgeous. And we opened against Nebraska. And when he told us to enjoy our meal and what time the bus was leaving for the stadium, he says, "Anderson, I want you to stay." I said, why was he stopping me from going to have a pregame meal? But I stood there and I thought, oh my gosh, I probably can't dress because I dropped below 2.0. But when everybody got out of earshot, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, just wanted to tell you that you're starting at halfback for me this afternoon because you're the best I have at that position. He says, I want you to hold your head up high and lift your knees up high and run like a stallion." I tried to. We opened against Nebraska, if you remember. I picked up, I think it was 138 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I want to wish you lots of luck. I hope I'm with you. Go Army, beat Navy.
Hi, I'm Roy O'Connor. I was honored to be elected as chairman of the honor committee during our first year. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how the honor system worked back in our day. I may refer to my notes. After all, it's been 60 years. We had 24 honor committee reps back at that time. They were elected during cow year so they could take that year to learn and really observe the diversity committee so that they know their duties and be ready to take over during our first year. Back then, the honor committee was fully responsible for running the honor system. The deputy commandant, George A. O'Connor, and that's no relation to me, that was Albert O'Connor, C-O-N-N-E-R, was the officer in charge. He was a tremendous help to me. He was a graduate, a great advisor and experienced officer. The honor committee, or excuse me, the honor code stated simply that a cadet would not lie, cheat, or steal. The code applied to all our activities in our daily lives, and we would not tolerate anyone who violated the code. I'm sure we all remember parts of the honor system like the all rights, the absence card, the signatures, and how personal property was safe. The honor committee understood and carried out its duties and responsibilities with the highest amount of respect for each and every cadet. The honor code was simpler in those days, but it was really stricter. There was only one punishment. If a violator violated the code, it meant dismissal from West Point. Now, how the system worked. If a cadet was suspected of breaking the honor code, the accuser would approach that cadet, and if he was not able to resolve the issue, would then refer to the company honor rep. The honor rep, in turn, then would meet with that cadet and talk to him about it. If he could not resolve it, then he referred to me as the chair of the committee, and it was my responsibility to then appoint an investigating committee. I would select several honor representatives from companies other than the company in which that cadet was a member. Again, they would then report back, and if there was enough evidence that there was a probable violation of the code, then I would have to schedule a trial. The trials were conducted by the honor committee without any commissioned officers present. No officers were present in the room. It was completely run by us, the cadets. 12 honor committee members would serve as a jury for that trial. And they also would hear all the evidence, plus the accused had an opportunity to speak on his own behalf. If the offender was found guilty, he would be transferred to the boarders ward in the post hospital and given the option to appear before a board of officers. None of the accused that came up during our period of time chose to request a board during our time, our years at West Point. If an officers board was held and found a cadet was innocent, then that person could have returned to the Corps, but he would have been silenced. And I don't know if you remember that, but by silencing, we meant the cadet could stay at West Point, but no cadets were to speak to him. I'm glad that we never experienced that. Most offenders left the post the next day, and soon thereafter. That's briefly how the honor system worked. I'm really proud that we left the honor system and the honor code strong and intact for the classes that were to follow us. Thank you, and let's beat Navy again.
Many of you may remember the Pittsburgh game in 1958. That was our class trip to a football game. And when we started that game,
we were #1 in the country. This is a story about one play that changed our entire season, and I'd like to tell you the aftermath of that play. And so I started the Pittsburgh game, and I was having a very good game. I'd scored a touchdown, intercepted a pass. Don Nursery had caught a pass from Bob Anderson, and we were 14-0 right before the half. And right before the half, I was pulled out and Pete was put in. I came off wondering why I was pulled out. I did not know, and no one could explain it to me. Well, a few seconds later, the Pittsburgh quarterback threw a long touchdown pass over Pete's head, and they scored. Even though they missed the extra point, it was 14-6, and we had let them back into the ball game. Well, when we came back 10 years ago to our 50th football team anniversary and reunion, I was walking into the Thayer Hotel, and I saw one of our coaches sitting there in the lobby, Frank Lauterbar, who was the offensive line coach. And I walked up to him and said hello and sat down, and we started chatting. And I said, Coach, one of the things that I've never understood for 50 years is why Coach Blake pulled me out of that game right before the half. And he said, well, Coach Blake didn't pull you out of that game. I said, what do you mean he didn't pull me out of the game? He said, no, it was Tom Harp, your offensive backfield coach. He was sitting up in the press box that day, and he decided to make that call. Well, Tom was at the reunion, and I chatted with him, and he said, Steve, to be honest with you, that was the worst football call I made in my entire coaching career, and I'm sorry I ever made it. Well, what was interesting about that play, had we been able to beat Pittsburgh that day, which I think we could have, they came back in the second half all fired up, and they ended up with a 14-14 tie, because back in those days, you didn't break ties. The game ended just the way it was. Had we been able to win that game, I believe we would have at least been in a tie with LSU for the national championship that year, if not winning the national championship that year. So it was a very interesting play that had great consequences on our season.
I'm sure you all remember the Pittsburgh football trip cow year. At that time, we had a yearling in B1 named Frank Sisk, who was a native of Pittsburgh. And before we left on that trip, Frank told several of us, now, after the game, you're probably going to want to go get a drink. He said, you go to any bar and tell them you know Frank Sisk, and you will not have to buy a drink. Everybody will buy drinks for you. Well, of course, we doubted that thoroughly. Frank was known to be a BS artist, good guy, but somewhat of a braggart. But anyway, after the game, several of us from B1 walked out and started wandering around trying to find some place where we could buy a drink. And we just passed a little neighborhood bar and said, well, let's just go in here. So we did. It was full of men. And just for the heck of us, one of us said, say, do any of you fellas happen to know a guy named Frank Sisk? And they all said, oh, yeah, we know Frank Sisk. Hey, these guys know Frank Sisk. Let's buy him a drink. For the rest of the night, we didn't buy another drink.
Well, sports fans, let me tell you about a very special sports season, one you're probably completely unaware of, even though you were there and maybe even participated in. And that was the fall of 1958. In 31 head-to-head competitions by our 4 varsity teams, we suffered but a single loss. Think of that. And those wins included 4 over Navy. We're all aware of our varsity football team, undefeated and nationally ranked. 150-pound footballers creamed each of their opponents. Soccer had a single loss in an otherwise fine season. And then there was cross country. For us, it was a magical season.
We were undefeated in our dual and triangular meets. We were heptagonal champions. We were third in the Eastern Regionals behind Michigan State and Notre Dame. And based on all that, we were invited to run in the NCAA National Championships. First Army team ever to go. It was quite a weekend. We finished out our regular season against Navy on Saturday, nearly skunked them, flew to East Lansing on Sunday and walked the course, which turned out to be 4 miles, as opposed to the 5 we normally ran. Competed on Monday and were back in class the next day. We did very well. Dick Green, Gene Wilson, and I finished in the top 26 runners with Dick at the point. We were third overall, third in the country, 1 ahead of Notre Dame. Still the best an Army team has ever done in a competition. And so there you have it, another tale of daring do from our past, when giants stood the plain.
One of the most pleasant duties I had as first captain was meeting dignitaries and other famous people while representing the Corps Cadets, and I did that along with other members of the class. I remember meeting Nikita Khrushchev at the White House, and also we ran up to Hyde Park and I met Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt when we laid a wreath at the president's tomb. One of the chance meetings that I had that was most memorable was when Bob Montgomery and I were studying in the 8th1/2 Division one evening, and a knock came at the door. We were reading our lesson in military art and history about the Battle of the Bulge. I answered the door, and there stood General Omar Bradley. And I said, "My goodness, please come in, General Bradley." And he came in, and he said, "What are you up to this evening?" And we both said, "We're studying the Battle of the Bulge." And he said, "I know something about that." And we said, "Of course you do. Please have a seat and tell us all about it." So we got him a chair. He sat down and he regaled us with stories of the Battle of the Bulge from his perspective, his analysis before the fight and the analysis during the fight, and it was amazing. It was a wonderful tutorial, and we hated to see him go, but he left after about an hour and 15 minutes.
Part of our training at Camp Buckner was setting up for a convoy ambush. Our platoon was all set up, had our M1 rifles at the ready, and everybody was set except for Mark Lowry. Now, Mark had been issued a bazooka, but he wanted something that really fired. So he put a little ingenuity to work and found an old sea ration can along the side of the road, loaded it in the back end of his bazooka, and had his loader, the guy that would normally put the ammo in, put his M1 rifle up against the can in the back of the bazooka. When the convoy came down the road, Mark waited till the right moment and then yelled, "Fire!" His loader pulled the trigger, and the blast from the blank round propelled the can out of the bazooka, and he hit the truck right in the windshield. Mark got a big kick out of it, but he also got a very big slug.
Following our cow trip, 5 of us, Mike Fields, Bill McNamara, Gina McLaughlin, Jack Dice, and myself, headed down to McGuire Air Force Base for a trip, Space A, back to Germany, to Europe at that time. We landed in Orly and spent about 2 or 3 days in Paris having a delightful time, and probably the highlight was going to the club's Sex Appeal. And following that, we headed down to Châteauroux Air Force Base to pick up a Space A flight to Athens, Greece. Unfortunately, when we got down there, we had been aced out by a warrant officer who was active duty, and so we ended up asking the fellow at the desk there where we could fly to or where we could go. We were offered a chance to go to Oslo, Norway, or to Bovington RAF base in London, England. So we elected to go to Bovington Air Force Base in England. And when we got to England, it was about an hour outside of London, and we went down to the Columbia House and see if they had room for us, and there was no room available. But while we were there, a colonel walked in, looked at us, and started laughing. He said he hadn't seen that uniform since 1946. At that point, we told him our names and all that. And he invited us over to his room his house, rather, his apartment, to spend the evening, and he'd put us all up. Well, we went over there and had a nice meeting with the wife and the mother-in-law. And then the mother-in-law offered to take us all out to supper. And from the indication of the colonel, don't worry about it. So we all went out to supper. When we got back a little bit later, we found out that the lieutenant colonel, his last name was Arnold, and he was Hap Arnold's son. And the mother-in-law was Mrs. Douglas Aircraft Company. So it was really a splendid weekend there. And then following that, we were able to pick up a flight to Ireland with the 3rd Air Force track team, going to Ireland to Shannon for 3 days and then returning. So the idea of being able to get to Ireland and coming back was really a great, great idea. So we headed over to Shannon, Ireland, and we landed at Shannon. We got off the C-47, still wearing the parachutes that we had. And the first transcontinental 707 was landing there at Shannon at the same time. They got off and walked on a red carpet, and we walked on the runway. Anyway, we made our way downtown Galway Bay, Ireland, and stayed at the Hotel Norway. Directly across from the Hotel Norway was a series of Irish pubs. And following dinner that evening, we went over to one of the pubs to have a nice drink and some conversation. You know, it was a typical Irish pub that sits at a dance floor, and in the center of the dance floor was a microphone. So when one of the boys would get melancholy and sad, he could walk out there, get the mic, and start belting out a song. Well, there he was doing that. I looked on the wall and I saw these pictures, and they looked kind of familiar. So I got up, walked over, and looked at the first picture, and it was the 1st Regiment of cadets on parade at West Point. Then the second picture was the color guard from West Point, and then the 3rd picture was the 1st Regiment online. And I muttered to myself very loud, you can travel the whole world over and you can't get away from that damn place. At that point, a big burly Irishman looked at me and said, what do you be, part of the Queen's Guard? And I replied, no, this was West Point back in the United States. Just as an add to it, the movie playing in Galway that night was The Long Grey Line. Anyway, when he found out we were from West Point, he wanted us to ship him rifles and machine guns. At that point, the Irishman that we had walked in there with calmly got us all out of there before we got in any more trouble. So anyway, it was an interesting evening, and we finally headed back to Rhine, Maine, and back to the States. And we were supposed to land at Charleston, but the weather was bad. But they promised us they would drop us at McGuire, and then they took us to Charleston and dumped us. So it was one of those great West Point summer trips.
And I'm here to talk to you about the time Andy Rux fired a blank round at a June Week parade. Andy is not here to tell this story himself. He died in '08 of leukemia. But I am the right person to tell the story for 2 reasons. 1, I gave him the round, and 2, I visited with him shortly before he died and downloaded from his website, in his words, the first-person story. So I won't tell the story. I will let Andy tell it himself. Okay, here it is. I've decided to relate this story so all the rumors surrounding the incident will be put to rest. I did it, so I'm the one to tell the story. During June week of our yearling year, we cleaned out our rooms and put our belongings in the foot lockers that we left in the basements between the school years. Each day we had a retreat parade in preparation for the big graduation ceremony at the end of the week. While getting in place for one of the afternoon retreat parades, a classmate of mine discovered a blank round he had found in his stuff that was left over from our previous year's training. "Hey, look what I got," he shouted. Not thinking at all, I said, "Well, give it to me." And for some reason, he did. At that time, I had no plans for it, but I stuck it in my rifle and off we marched to the parade grounds. While marching out, a plan hatched in my pea brain. Why not shoot it off when the cannons sound retreat? So when the time for the cannons to go off, I shot off the blank round as we stood at present arms. Well, wouldn't you know it, the retreat cannons did not go off, but I sure did. You can imagine the sight from the grandstand. No cannon, but a crack and a puff of smoke from out of the cadet ranks. They couldn't tell exactly where, but they could isolate it to a couple of cadet companies. We kept up the parade and marched off the field. When we got to the barracks, there were officers lined up all the way in, so no one could escape. I didn't have any plan at all for this caper, so I was trapped. They had us open ranks and did inspection arms, and when it got to me, I opened up my rifle and out came the blank round. It went tinkle tinkle onto the pavement, the place went crazy, and I was arrested on the spot. Being arrested for a cadet isn't much worse than just being a cadet. I was confined to my room and could only go to the John and to meals. At the time, I wasn't aware that major punishments at West Point had to be reviewed by the Department of the Army. I found this out because both the COM and the SOUP recommended that I be dismissed, but they were overruled by the Secretary of the Army, who happened to have been standing at that parade. I ended up with the maximum punishment available: 6 months of confinement, 132 hours marching the area, and the loss of summer leave. So while everyone else went home for a month of leave, I spent the time out at Camp Buckner. My day consisted of breakfast, 3 hours walk in the area, lunch, 3 hours walk in the area, dinner, and 2 hours walk in the area. On Sunday mornings, they let me go to church. At the start of the school year, I had most of my hours walked off, so my school year wasn't much different than anyone else's. To this day, I do not know why I did this little caper. It certainly wasn't premeditated, and I had no contingency plan. I certainly wasn't trying to get away with anything or to try to be some sort of a wise guy. It just sort of happened. For a supposedly smart dude, this was probably the dumbest thing that I ever could have done. But for better or worse, I did it, and this is my story.
It was during the football season of yearling year, and I was rooming with Bill Carpenter and Norm Kluklinski. Our room was the first room as you entered M2 on the left. It was a Saturday morning, and Bill and I were getting ready to go over to the gym to get ready for a football game. And as we had to do as football players, we had to lay everything out on our beds because we were not participating in parades on Saturday. While we were standing there was a knock on the door, and we heard the word attention, and we all came to attention. And into our room walks President Dwight Eisenhower with a large entourage of people. We introduced ourselves. He shook our hands. We chit-chatted for just a few minutes. And then President Eisenhower walked over to my locker, and he looked at my grade card. And he said, Mr. Waldrop, I see that you're having difficulty in chemistry because you're deficient. And I said, yes, sir, I am having difficulty in chemistry. He said, well, when I was a cadet here, all we did is we took 2 containers of liquids, mixed them together, and that was generally the answer to the question. And I said, yes, sir, I think what my problem is I'm mixing all the wrong chemicals and solutions. And he laughed, and it was a big joke, and he really enjoyed it. And then he said, well, I want to wish you boys good luck in your careers in life. And then he left and walked out of the room and turned left to go down the hall. And I said, hey, Bill, we got to go over to the gym to get ready for the game. And we're behind right now, so we need to get over there. And so I went over to my bed and picked up my rifle and closed the bolt to put it back into my rifle rack. And that room filled with Secret Service agents with their hands in their jackets asking, who shut that bolt? And I said, what? And they said, who closed that bolt? And I said, oh, I closed the bolt. I was putting my rifle back into my rifle rack. Well, that satisfied the fact that I wasn't going to shoot the President of the United States, and they left the room, and then Bill and I went over to the gym and got ready for the game, and we won the game.
Next is my home team, K1. To break the spell of gloom period in early '59, Emer and I thought up a diversion. Yes, Emer was a star man. We lost him a while back. He was a wonderful human being, a great roommate, and a lifelong friend. You're missed, buddy. Here was the prank. Place the barrel of the Reveille cannon underneath Pete Dawkins' table back in the core squad area. Peter was on the hockey team at the time. We reconned the cannon during the day and night to assess the target. The barrel was about 150 pounds and it was held in place by 2 clamps and 4 bolts to the steel chassis. In the 2 weeks prior to the mission, we signed out adjustable pipe wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, hacksaws, and penetrating oil. Security was so important that initially Emer and I and 2 others knew about the operation, finally recruiting the full crew the night before. To form a cradle for the barrel, we used 2 2-inch pipes, 10 foot in length and 1 1/2 inch rope. We also signed out 6 PRC-6s for the lookouts. My recollection of the participants was Emer and I from 60, supported by 10 others from 61. We met and then set out in the tunnels at 0030 and infiltrated to Trophy Point, putting out all sentries by 0130. We took the cover off the cannon and removed the breech block. That was easy. We had done it before. We chipped off the paint from around the nuts and bolts and poured in the penetrating oil. We had 1 bolt off in 30 minutes. The team was elated. The second and third bolts and nuts were much more difficult. We could not get the penetrating oil to soak into the threads. With chisels and hammers, we finally got the second and third nuts and bolts off by 0400. We had a couple of alerts by our sentries of MPs coming around the plane, but we successfully concealed ourselves. We continued to work on the 4th nut and bolt. We soaked the nut in various places and tried various wrenches, and then chiseled off points on the bolts, and then hacksawed off the nut on the top and the head of the bolt underneath. This left only a 1/2 inch of the bolt holding the bracket. Someone had welded the bolt in place. It was 0500 now and the sun was coming up. We used one of the 2-inch pipes forced down the barrel for 4 or 5 people, pushing up and down on the pipe as a lever. We could not break the remaining portion of the bolt. We released our security and launched the team to the mess hall, with the breech block and placed it under the OC stable on the poop deck. We continued to shake the pipe in the barrel, but we were fully frustrated that such a small amount of bolts stood in the way of the mission. At 0535, we terminated the mission. I wish I had a video of the team of 6 or 7 men running across the plain with pipes and tools, all dressed in black in full sunlight, running past the OC's office and into the sinks of South Area to stow the equipment, and dress for reveille. Although the mission failed, it was mounted with great planning, creativity, organization, rehearsal, and high energy, and undone by insufficient planning for a small unknown. If you're ever curious about the moles, look in the 50th yearbook and ask around in the class. You may get a smirk for an answer. Be Navy.
Okay, as a cadet, I was in Company B1. My 2 roommates were Dick Campbell and Tony Baker for 3.5 years. So we got to know each other pretty well. Dick was an exemplary cadet. He ended up being our cadet company commander. He was an outstanding student, very serious in every respect. Tony was kind of at the other end of the spectrum. Tony was loose, enjoyed himself, had a good time, didn't work real hard. And this story takes place right before a brigade or a regimental review on the plane. Before we started getting ready for that, Tony challenged Dick. He said, "I can wait longer than you can to start getting ready for this review." Well, as you all remember, it took a while and took a little work to get all of that equipment on, all that full dress and white belts and everything. And of course, Dick rose to the challenge immediately. He said, "No, you can't." He said, "I'll outweight you." So they sat in their underwear on either side of their desks as I was going through the drill of getting ready. And the plebe in the hall started calling the minutes. "Sir, there are 10 minutes to brigade review, blah, blah, blah." And they just sat there and looked at each other. 9 minutes, 8 minutes, going down the line. And as those minutes diminished, Dick became notably nervous. And Tony just sat back in his chair with a big grin on his face. Well, as I was about to walk out the door and they were still sitting there in their underwear, Tony said to Dick, "Oh, by the way, Dick, I don't think I mentioned to you that I'm excused from this parade." Well, at that, Dick flew out of that chair and immediately started throwing his uniform on, and I just walked on out the door, and Dick ended up being late.
My memory may be getting a little short nowadays, but I'm going to try to give you some of the things that I remember about the class of 1960 and the 150-pound football team. The name comes, of course, from having to weigh in at 154 or less on the day of the game. That, of course, brings back a lot of memories. Pushing away from the table, because most of us on the team probably were within a few pounds of 160 during most of the year. So it meant pushing away from the table, sweating a lot, not drinking anything on Friday night, and until we weighed in on Saturday. Well, everyone except Doc Sutton. Doc, during a yearling year and cow year, would jump on the scales with his shoulder pads on. Doc was the envy of us all because Doc could eat. I have some other memories too. Joe Dean coming back to the huddle with his helmet about 15 to 20 degrees off center. He was our center. And he stuck his head in and did a lot of damage. Remember Doc Sutton going around in and dropping his shoulder to what seemed to be about 6 inches from the ground and plowing into somebody who mistakenly thought they were going to plow into him. And then there's Jim Humphreys. Jim was fast, elusive. He'd get around in, and he was surely going to go all the way. The class of 60 did a very, very good job of getting 150-pound football off the ground. Our cow year, because we so dominated the league, there was no all-conference team selected. First class year, however, they did select 11 players because we played both offense and defense, and 4 of those 11 were from the class of 1960. Those 3 years, the first 3 years of 150 football, later called sprint football, 1 loss, 1 tie, and all the rest were wins.
At the end of yearling year, I looked at the schedule academically for cow year and wondered how in the world I was going to be able to survive academics and play football at the same time. I asked Dick Herbert if he would be my roommate during cow year to assist me academically, and he agreed. After we came back from summer leave, I started cow year in the last section of most subjects. I was in Captain Borman, Frank Borman's class in thermodynamics. And as we went through the first month, I was going 3.0, 2.9, 2.8, 2.7, 2.9, 3.0. And when we finished that month, as we were leaving the last day of class, Captain Borman said, "Mr. Walter, will you stay after class?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he closed the door, and with a very serious look, looked at me and said, "Mr. Walter, you do know we have an honor system here?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I know we have an honor system here." And he said, "Well, for the life of me, I cannot figure out how you're going 3.0 and 2.9 and 2.7 in this class, in the last section." And I said, "Sir, I'll tell you, during leave, I didn't go on leave. I went to Arlington State University every single day, which was a 25-mile trip one way, and I studied thermodynamics and solids. So I would be prepared for the coming year." When I went to Arlington State, the professor told me one thing the first day. He said, "Steve, don't worry about understanding any of this, just memorize it." So I spec'd all of the formulas, and I was able to do very well that first month. I was sent up to the 3rd section the second month, and I explained to all my friends in the last section, "Don't worry, I will be back soon." And I was.
I first met Joe Pallone in plebe boxing, and I was sitting in the middle of the boxing ring, spraddle-legged, knocked out. And Joe was waving smelling salts under my nose, and when I came to, he said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, get back in there and finish the round." So we did that round and finished round 3. The next time I saw Joe Pallone was in soccer. I'd never seen a soccer ball or a soccer match or know anything about soccer, but I got picked up on plebe soccer, and I sat on the bench most of the year. Yearling year, I sat on the bench but substituted some. And spring practice, yearling year, Joe Pallone shows up on the athletic field, and he yells over, he'd been coaching baseball for 3 years, so then he comes back to take the soccer team over. He yells over, hey, Chappell, take right wing. And I holler back, I don't know anything about right wing. What am I do over there? And he said, look, just kick the ball down in the corner, beat everybody to it, and center it so Lee Formello can make a goal. So basically, that's what I did for the next 2 years on varsity soccer. Our 1959 team, first year, we had 7 wins, 1 loss, and 2 ties. That year was the first year in West Point history that the soccer team was invited to the NCAA tournament and playoffs. We had 5 All-Americans on that team. We had Hank Watson, second string. We had Lee Formello, honorable mention. And then we had 3 regional All-Americans, Bev Powell, Kaiser Prazan, and Philip Chappell. The one loss we had in that season was to Navy, unfortunately. And the only reason we lost that, I think, is because we found out just before the Navy game that the soup had turned us down and wouldn't let us go to the NCAA playoffs. So morale dropped like a rock, and we lost the Navy in a double overtime at Annapolis. Over a 29-year span that he taught soccer or coached soccer, he had 228 wins, 80 losses, and 35 ties. And out of those 29 years, he had 26 winning seasons. That gave him a .715 winning average, which is still today among the highest in all of NCAA collegiate soccer. He took 11 teams over the years to the NCAA playoffs, 4 of which got to the semifinals. He won 3 Eastern titles. Today, Joe Pallone remains on the ballot for entry into the Soccer Coaches Association of America Hall of Fame. He is by far, without a doubt, the best coach I have ever played for. We love you, Joe.
I played soccer, and during the season, I often found it necessary to study at night in the hallway outside of our room after taps using the light from the hallway. But since we lived on the 3rd floor, and the plebes who lived on the 1st floor were tasked with banging on the radiator should anybody untoward come into the barracks after taps, I felt quite comfortable in having time to stow my gear and get under my brown boy. This particular night I was studying in the hallway. It was after taps. It was banging on the radiators. As I started to collect my papers, when to my wondering eyes should appear a tall officer in dress greens with one shoe on and one shoe off, so lively and quick that I knew it was not St. Nick. It was Long Tom, Colonel Tom Rienzi, one of our most loved tactical officers. He had come up the stairs 3 at a time with one shoe on and the other spit-shine low quarter in his hands. So if you could hear him, you would only hear every 6 steps. He was there in a flash. We had a small discussion about the importance of sleep and the fact that he respected cadets who studied. My assignment was then to, and I quote, write a 1-paper point of view on why the Signal Corps is one of the more important arms of the combat arms, unquote, and have it in my office forthwith, but not until you get a good night's sleep. And with that, he turned around and disappeared almost as fast as he appeared.
The next hotbed was D1. Tom Einen and Joel Spivak did many patrols in the tunnels. One such was aimed at the Reveille Cannon. As the patrol headed out, they went by the soup's place and put his bicycle in his enormous chest freezer. Now that's a prank. I wonder what the soup thought of that. Moreover, I wonder what Mrs. Soup thought about the cadets wandering around her basement in the middle of the night. I can't believe the tunnels allowed access to the soup's basement. These guys should have gotten a medal for that prank. Of course, quarters one had to get heat somehow. Arriving at the cannon, the team dismantled the breech block, which was about half the size of a cinder block and weighing about 30 pounds. They hauled it up through the tunnels to the West Academic Building and thence up the stairs to the roof. Then they looped a rope through the block. They used another rope in a loop and then lowered it over the parapet and onto the neck of the large gargoyle near the face of the clock tower. They then withdrew the second rope and retreated to their rooms. I know you all can remember the breech block hanging there, since it took a few days before the Highland Falls Fire Department to get it down. Obviously, the prank was to provide a measure of elan and humor for the Corps. I would venture a guess that the fixation for pranks on the Reveille Cannon was somewhat energized by the long shadow of Cadet MacArthur's example of moving the entire Reveille Cannon to the roof of the clock tower, an amazing feat of arms, by a starman no less. I wonder if he ever told his Thayer hotel-dwelling mom. Thinking about that feat now, I can only believe that he disassembled the cannon on Trophy Point, carrying the parts to the roof and then reassembling it. It would have taken a large team.
Charlie here. One more story. It was Cal year 1958. We were undefeated and traveling to South Bend to play the hated Irish in our third game. The Corps was fired up. I would say half the cadets stayed in their room that afternoon to listen to it on the radio. Unfortunately, I was marching punishment tours in Central area at the time. I remember halfway across the area, sometime deep into the fourth quarter, I started to hear the game on the radio. Somebody in G1 had put a radio in his window for us. By the time I got over there, I learned that we were winning by 7-2. My next trip across and back, our legendary classmate, K.T. Gould, was probably 20, 30 yards in front of me. And as he neared the other side, Pete Dawkins scores a touchdown, and suddenly we're up 14-2. Carl, instead of doing a snappy about face, just kept on walking right over to the G1 stoops and leaned his rifle up against the rail. All the cadets behind him hesitated at first, but then they broke ranks and they just followed him over there. By the time the sergeant of the guard in command of the area squad got over there, he was the epitome of indecision, and he just gave up before he even started. The entire area squad, maybe 80 wayward cadets, clustered around the radio to the bitter end. When the final whistle blew, all those lords of indiscipline ran off to their barracks, hollering, "Rally, rally, rally." Hundreds of cadets poured out of the barracks, in violation of every cadet uniform regulation, right on down to pajamas in public. We, the rabble we had heard about, paraded past the Soup's house and on the battle monument where we sang, "On Brave Old Army Team." It was a grand day at our rock-bound Highland home. 2 months later, still undefeated, led by Bobby Anderson and Bill and Joe and our other class of 60 classmates, beat Navy. And that was it. Beat Navy. Yeah.
plebe year. First night in Beast Barracks, my roommate told me that he was planning to go to medical school right after West Point. I told him that wasn't possible. I told him, don't tell the upperclassmen this because we have to stay here for 6 weeks before we can leave. He didn't listen to me, and sure enough, they really gave us hell for the next 6 weeks. The following plebe Christmas, I went to Smith Rink to go ice skating. And when I was there, I saw Joe Staling with this beautiful redhead, just very nicely shaped. And I made up my mind I was gonna snag him. Well, he went to get the girl some hot chocolate, and while he left her alone, I went down, I introduced myself, I said, I'm Bob Totten, I'm Joe's company mate, and I'd like to introduce myself. Well, she turned to me, she flashed a beautiful smile and said, Chase, I'm so glad to meet you. I'm from Brooklyn. That ended that. Plebe Christmas again. I'd saved $20 to spend during plebe Christmas. The very first night, I lost it all in a poker game. I learned quickly not to gamble. Then at the end of plebe year, when the class of 57 broke and ran at graduation parade, I just thought it was the way it was normally done. I didn't realize that that was not supposed to be done. Okay, moving on to yearling year. I was playing chess with my grandfather by mail. He had taught me how to play chess while my dad was in the Pacific during World War II. And so here we were playing a game of chess. He lived in California. Of course, we were at West Point. And every 2 weeks, we would send each other a move in response to the other. Now, he was a great athlete. He was actually an All-American football player, both at Harvard and at West Point. And he later coached the Army football team before and after World War I. Well, I tried out for the baseball team. Took them about 3 days to realize that I was not baseball material. So I wrote him a note and I said, here you were an All-American football player. My uncle was a national champion tennis player. My father was a varsity boxer and a varsity polo player. He wrote back to me and he said, that may be, but you're the first one in the family to make the dean's list, and that'll last you a lot longer than the sports. Finally, in first class year, I was taking my fiance to the hospital for some reason, I don't recall what. And it was a bitterly cold day. I was escorting her across the parking lot, holding her arm to keep her from slipping on the ice. And sure enough, an officer in the administration building looked over, saw that, called the hospital, told them to stop that cadet that had just come in. And he got my name, and I got an 8 and 8 slug out of that.
By some quirk of fate, some statistical aberration, I got sectioned into the first section in physics. I did not belong there, and I knew I wouldn't be there very long, but I didn't want to embarrass myself in the eyes of my Hy-Vee classmates, so I studied extra hard. And when schedules allowed, I got to class early so I could try to rememorize what I had tried to memorize the night before. This particular afternoon, I got there early, but so did Steve Scott. Well done, Steve. Be thou at peace. And Steve was a hive, and Steve had nothing else to do, so he started to mess around. I asked him, please, to leave me alone, let me study. Steve had a tad of the devil in him, and he continued to mess around, so I turned around and ever so slightly pushed him. At that point, 2 things happened instantaneously. Number 1, the professor came in, the P came in the room. Number 2, Steve stumbled and fell against one of those old leaded antique beautiful windows. I got written up, got quilled, 13 demerits for my actions. But I thought the language used by the professor in writing up the quill was memorable. And I quote, Cadet Prosser, attempting to bone files, i.e., pushing classmate who stood higher in the class out the 7th floor classroom window.
I call this story the Great Juarez Escape and Evasion. It took place during the cow trip in the summer of 1958 when we went to Fort Bliss, Texas. And of course, Fort Bliss is across the river, across the border from the Mexican city of Juarez. Well, the first night, there was a hop on post, and all those classmates who signed up for blind dates, of course, went to the hop. I didn't sign up for a blind date. I'd had my share of blind dates and never was very lucky. So I went into Juarez to sample the delights of that city. And of course, I had to go in uniform. Well, the next morning, my B1 classmate, Gene Howell, said, "Phil, I want to go into Juarez with you tonight." I said, "Okay, Gene, we'll go into Juarez," but I said, "We're not going to go in uniform." Of course, that was a big no-no. But we knew a fella who lived at Fort Bliss with his family, with his dad, who was an Army officer. He'd been in B1 and was turned back. So he was waiting to re-enter West Point. But we went to see him and asked him for some civilian clothes. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I'll fix you up." He gave us each a very loud Hawaiian shirt, which we wore over our white uniform trousers and our shiny black uniform shoes, and we were just cleverly disguised. So we went into Juarez, got off the bus and walked down the main street, and we passed a bookstore. Standing in the doorway of the bookstore was a lieutenant colonel TAC officer who was part of the trip. He looked up from his book and turned and looked us right in the eye, and I could see he knew without a shadow of a doubt that we were cadets. So I said, "Gene, we got to walk fast." So we took off walking as fast as we could, dodging the Mexican population on the sidewalk. And I looked back, and sure enough, that officer was coming after us. I nudged Gene in the ribs and said, "Gene, we got to run." So we took off running. Looked back again, and sure enough, he was running after us. Well, fortunately, we passed an open doorway, and we ducked in that doorway and came into a Mexican house with a family all sitting around the dinner table having their evening meal. We ran right past them, out the back door, and fortunately, we were able to escape apprehension. But we had to sneak back across the border that night, got back into Fort Bliss, and for the rest of that trip, we kept a low profile.
It was the fall of yearling year, and my roommates were Bill Carpenter and Norm Kuklinski. One night, I had been very busy getting a lot of things done, and tap sounded, and Bill and Norm had already gone to bed. I took off all my clothes and put them in the laundry bag to get ready to put my pajamas on, when I realized that tomorrow was a football game and I had to lay everything out on my bed as football players had to do. So I got up, shined my breastplate, went over to the mirror by the sink, which was in the corner of our room, behind the door that opens to the room. And I adjusted my belts and my breastplate to make sure that they were correct. And while I was standing there, I said, "You know, I think I'll go ahead and get a little jump on tomorrow and go ahead and shave." So I put shaving cream all over my face, and I was just getting ready to shave when the door opened and the flashlight started roaming around the room. It was bed check. Well, I couldn't see who was doing the bed check, but I was behind the door, caught. All of a sudden, I had to clear my throat like that, and the flashlight came around the door, right on my face, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, who do we have here, Bro Bumble?" I said, "No, sir, Cadet Walter." I was standing at attention, buck naked, with cross belts and breastplate on with a full face of shaving cream. He was trying very hard not to laugh, but it was Major Hank Emerson, our tactical officer, and him too. And he said, "Well, it looks like you've got a pretty good jump on tomorrow, so why don't you finish shaving and get in bed, and good luck on the game." I did so, got in bed, had a good night's sleep.
This is a story about the night that I literally dumped on our tack. The stage was set because the yearlings across the hall kept on coming across after midnight and doing things to our room, like putting shaving cream on our desk, putting shaving cream in our shoes and on our mirrors, and we could never catch them. So rather than stay up late every night making believe we were asleep so we could catch them, I decided I would set a trap for them. The trap consisted of a 3-pound coffee can. We had a hole in the top where we tied a string, and the other end of the string went to the doorknob. And the coffee can itself sat up on the ledge above our door, which was where the transom was. And we filled it with about 24 golf balls. So this particular night, we set the trap, we hit the sack, and not only 2 or 3 minutes later, we heard the click, click of our tack coming down the hallway. It was too late to get up and take the track down. So I told my roommate, John, just make believe you're asleep. We heard the doorknob creak, the tack opened the door, and bada boom, down comes the coffee can and 24 golf balls banging up and down and up and down. And before the golf balls could settle down, he said, "I'll see you men in the morning." Well, we didn't get very much sleep, wondering what that meant. The next morning at Reveille, Captain Sharp shows up, meets the company commander and tells him, "Take me to Cadet Brindley." So they came off, got down right in my face, and the Captain Sharp says, "What was that all about?" I said, "Sir, I can explain." He says, "Yeah, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." So I explained to him that we set it up for the yearlings across the hall so we could catch them when they tried to mess up our room at night. I was sorry that he got the trick instead of the guys across the hall. Next Saturday was SAMI for Saturday morning inspection. I was the room orderly. Anything wrong with the room, I would get the merits for. And as I'm sitting in class, I remembered that I had a life-size print of Jane Mansfield taped to the back of my door. I said, I hope the TAC doesn't notice that. Well, when I got back from class, I checked out the quill list, and there was at the top, Brindley P. 1 demerit. Reason? Dirt behind door. Amen. End of story.